Okay. All right. Now, for those of you that don't know me, I'm a process engineer, and I'm working on the New Zealand Refining Company project. I do know quite a few of the faces here, but there are also quite a few of you that I haven't seen before. So, basically today we're going to talk about delayed coking, but we're also going to talk about some other issues. And some of it will be a little bit of a recap, because in the earlier presentations you go over a certain amount of material, but in order to understand some of the delayed coking, we do need to go over one or two things to make sure that people pick them up from the earlier presentations, because there might have been a couple of things on one slide 3 weeks ago and maybe you didn't remember it. So anyway, first item of business is a safety topic. As you know, we always start meetings with a safety presentation. This particular one comes from December 2005, and it's actually from Britain, which is originally where I'm from, although I've been here for quite a few years. Sunday, December the 11th, Sunday morning, everything is quiet. People are half asleep. They're not really paying attention to what's going on. 1:30 in the morning, stock check of the tank shows nothing unusual. Unfortunately, 3 o'clock in the morning, the level gauge stops working. So they're pumping in 2,400 gallons a minute of fuel, basically gasoline, and nobody's recording the level. And unfortunately, that means that the pump doesn't trip, and around about 5:20 in the morning, so that's 2 hours later, nobody's noticed, the excess gasoline flows over the side of the tank. And in those few minutes, until around about 6 a.m., I think it was 88,000 gallons of gasoline went over the side of the tank. Then we have what they call in the business an unconfined vapor cloud explosion. Basically, you've got an ignition source from somewhere, whether it's a spark, whether a passing car, or a piece of static discharge. But once you've got the gasoline, the ignition source, the fuel, and the air, we had a massive explosion about 6 a.m. The explosion, according to the newspapers, registered 2.3 on the Richter scale. So it was pretty, it's not a major earthquake, but I mean, it was a pretty good explosion. Believe it or not, there were no fatalities, all right? But 43 people were injured. This fire spread to another 20 tanks. So this is one tank, spread to another 20 tanks, and that is one of the biggest terminals in the London area, and it actually impacted flights in and out of London's airports because they were really short of jet fuel, and they were having problems refueling planes because this area just knocked out a huge amount of their supply. Now, you might think that this is a relatively simple thing, but it can have catastrophic consequences. And basically, it's very similar to what happened at Texas City, where a bunch of people got killed in 2005. We had the overfilling of a process vessel, and the overfilled material went into a blowdown drum. The blowdown drum got to atmosphere and unfortunately ignited and killed a bunch of people. So this, in the British incident, nobody actually got killed, but these kind of incidents happen pretty frequently. And they're easily avoidable, and they can be avoided by good process design with proper instruments and proper backups and things like that. But you also have to think a little bit about the system, and you need to monitor the system, because if you went into a service station and you filled up with 10 gallons of gasoline, maybe that's fine. 20 gallons, fine. But if you put 50 gallons in, maybe you start to think, well, how big is the tank? Maybe the gasoline's going somewhere else. And this is really what people need to think about when they design systems. They need to monitor the systems. If you're pumping fluid in, you know roughly the pumping rate, you know how long you're pumping it, then you know roughly when the tank's going to be full. So you should be watching out for these situations. Obviously, they didn't set any kind of alarm, So when it hit 5 in the morning, nobody was watching, the stuff just overflowed. And believe it or not, the stuff was on closed-circuit TV, so in the accident investigation, they were actually able to go back and view the whole thing on video. Obviously, nobody in the control room was actually watching it in real time. Now, there's one other safety topic I have, which is a very interesting one. It's about static electric in filling stations, petrol in Britain, gasoline in this country. Most of us are not aware that simple devices like cell phones are not what we call intrinsically safe. So intrinsically safe means that you can operate it in a hazardous environment. So if you go into a refinery or something, normally you cannot carry a cell phone because electrically it's not intrinsically safe, so it may generate a spark and it may cause an explosion. Now the same thing can happen when you're filling up fuel. So you see people on their phones getting in and out of the car while they're filling up, and there are a significant number of fires. You wouldn't believe it, but here they had 150 cases of this type where people have got in and out of the vehicle. Maybe they're wearing the wrong type of clothing, very synthetic clothing. Maybe the humidity was very low and the circumstances were bad. But if you've seen one or two of the videos of these can be quite frightening. You basically, suddenly you'll see a flame out right around the area where you're filling up. And so there's several several items of advice here. You're never supposed to use a cell phone or a mobile phone when you're filling up because it's not intrinsically safe. But you see people doing it all the time. They're on the phone, getting in and out of the car. And these other items here, basically, once you get out of the vehicle, close the door, fill up, but don't get in and out because you may generate a little bit of static electricity. And most of these cases were linked to that. And it's something most of us don't even think about. And I've never actually seen one of these fires in real time, but I've seen the video, and I certainly wouldn't want to be there. So I don't know if there are any questions on that, but if not, we're going to move on to the main presentation, which is on delayed coking. Let me jump over to this. Now it's entitled Delayed Coking, but it's also subtitled here, Other Resid Upgrading Methods. And basically, I need to explain a little bit about what we're doing with a delayed coker and why would you use a delayed coker. Just to give you a little information on me, this is my contact information. I'm across the street here in Monrovia, and that's my email. And I'm on the second floor of the Monrovia building, although I believe we're going to move in maybe another month. So this is the agenda for what we're going to talk about today. First of all, a little bit why you would be interested in delayed coking. Then we're going to talk a little bit about what makes a good transportation fuel, what makes good gasoline, good diesel. And then we're going to talk about resid upgrading, which is really what delayed coking is used for. And resid is what is often called the bottom of the barrel. It's the heaviest, gunkiest sort of stuff, the least useful sort of stuff. And you want to do something useful with it. And we have several processes here that we will go over. And the main one we're going to talk about is delayed coking, and then at the end we'll just wrap things up. I have a short quiz. It's only 7 questions. I'm not going to grade it or anything, but if you're awake during the class, you shouldn't have any problem with the quiz. All right, why delayed coking? This is a crude column. We start off with crude oil and crude tanks, and we feed through a preheat train, and we go through what they call a desalter vessel to remove remove salt from the crude oil. When you transport crude, it goes through largely ocean tankers, and those ocean tankers, you can imagine a huge tanker filled with crude oil. When you take the crude oil out, you end up with this big empty vessel, and you have to put in some ballast material, otherwise this thing's going to capsize and sink or whatever. So typically they use seawater, and therefore the crude gets contaminated with salt. So we have to have a desalter, and then we go through some more preheat, and we go through a fired heater, and we go into just a straightforward distillation column, crude unit. And you've probably seen some of this before. And the major products we get, the top, working our way down, we've got LPG and naphtha. Naphtha is basically a gasoline boiling range material. Kerosene, that's jet fuel. Diesel, obviously for trucks and things. Gas oil is also a diesel boiling range material. And down here at the bottom is what is left. And this is reduced crude or residue or resid. And as you can see, we can use these different products, but we end up with something that we basically have problems using. And you may not think it's very much, but, and this is an actual tower. You can't really see it too well. These little side columns are what they call side strippers. And they're used to control basically the vapor pressure, the quality of the product. So you inject steam or you use a reboiler, and you're basically returning light material back to the column. And then this is the product stream. All right. So as far as uses for these different fuels, all right, we have naphtha, kero, light and heavy gas oil, which is a diesel range material. All of these things are all very useful, but then we end up with atmospheric resid, and it's this heavy, gunky sort of stuff. You obviously couldn't run a car on it, or even a diesel engine. So it's basically not a very valuable commodity. But obviously, if you can upgrade it somehow, then you can make use of it. Now, you guys remember the movie Jerry Maguire, and in there was a phrase about "show me the money." And there was a famous bank robber called Willie Sutton who was arrested many years ago. And when they questioned him, they asked him, "Well, why you rob banks, Willie?" And he said, "Because that's where the money is." All right? And the same is true in many other situations. You know, if we move on to refining, how do you make money in refining? Well, you have to go where the money is, and the money is in gasoline. So basically, you would want crude oil to be converted as much as possible into gasoline. And that way you could make the most money, the most profit in the refinery. The gasoline is the most valuable. Residue is not very valuable. Now you can run lighter crudes or heavier crudes. Heavier crudes are cheaper, but they make more residue. So you're making more of the less valuable material. But again, if you can find a way to use it and upgrade it, then you can use a heavier crude, which is cheaper, and again, you can improve your profitability. Now, I mentioned we make a little bit of resid at the bottom of the crude unit, and you may think, well, it's not much of a problem. Maybe we'll just we use it for asphalt or for other purposes. But the problem is, every barrel of crude oil ends up somewhere in the product slate. So if you bring in a lot of stuff, even if you only have a small percentage that you can't use, the stuff just accumulates. So for example, if 10% of the crude is residue, and the crude feeds 100,000 barrels a day, then you get 10,000 barrels a day of residue. That's 420,000 gallons of the stuff. So you better have a good use for it. Otherwise, you're going to have a big, big tank to store the stuff in. Delayed coking can convert some of this residue to gasoline. Not all of it, but some of it. So obviously you can take a low-value product, you use a delayed coker, process it, and you can produce some gasoline. So you've upgraded the value. Now, to give you some idea of capacity, in this business we talk a lot in terms of barrels a day, and I wanted to give you a feeling for what's a big refinery, what's a little refinery. The biggest refinery in the continental United States is Exxon's Baytown, Texas refinery. I thought its capacity was around 650,000 barrels a day. According to their website, it's only 563, so I put 563. Chevron El Segundo, which is right next to LAX, that's about 250,000 barrels a day. That's also a pretty large refinery. ExxonMobil in Torrance is 155,000 barrels a day. And then there are other refiners which are around 100, 120. And a small refiner might be 50,000 barrels. That's a relatively small refinery. But it gives you a feeling for the size of a unit and the size of what we talk about with a barrel. And a barrel is just 42 US gallons. So multiply by 42, you get the number of gallons. Now, this also helps you put things a little in perspective. Concorde is now retired from service, but if you compare Concorde with a Boeing 747, going from LAX to London, you use somewhere between 42 and 48,000 gallons of fuel for the one flight. And you can see here fuel capacity of a 747 is 51,000 gallons, and it burns around 3,700 gallons an hour. But the fuel economy is not that bad, actually. It's 38 miles per gallon per passenger. So that's really not too bad. But you burn it all in one night. So 48,000 gallons is a lot of fuel. Compare that with Concorde. Concorde, of course, goes twice as fast, burns 5,900 gallons an hour, and only gets 14 miles per gallon per passenger. So that's efficient, but maybe more fun. You know, I never flew Concorde myself, but two of my family, my dad and my brother, both made trips on Concorde. So it's quite an experience. So you're actually flying faster than a rifle bullet, which is hard to think about, but twice the speed of sound. All right, a refinery, this is an overall flow diagram, and I think you've seen diagrams like this in some of the previous training classes. This area is the crude area, and atmospheric tower and a vacuum tower. And then the various units we're going to talk about today, we've got resid coming here, we've got a propane deasphalter, a visbreaker, delayed coker, and various things like that. And these are the different products on the right-hand side that you make. To give you an idea of what these products are like, so here for liquefied petroleum gas, or LPG, that's the kind of stuff that you use for your backyard barbecue. It comes in the cylinders. Carbon number C1 to C4. And this is the boiling range. Gasoline and naphtha, C4 to C12. Kero and jet fuel, this range, and gas oil, heating oil. And then you can see down here is what we're left with, the resid, asphalt, waxes, stuff like that. Now, we talked a little bit about a crude distillation unit before. This is a typical example of one. Again, we've got a fired heater, the desalter, the main crude column. Sometimes we call it an atmospheric tower, the way they call it here. It operates just a little bit above atmospheric pressure, but it's not a very high pressure, maybe 10 psi, somewhere in that sort of range. It's not a very high pressure. And then these are these side strippers that improve the product quality. Now, the first thing that you can do with resid is to use vacuum distillation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But basically, you take the atmospheric resid, or here they call it topped crude, but it's the same thing. Put it through a heater, and you put it now through a vacuum column and do a vacuum distillation. And this is actually quite a low vacuum. See, 25 to 50 millimeters of mercury, and 760 millimeters of mercury is 1 atmosphere. So this is pretty low vacuum. And instead of making just light gas oil and heavy gas oil, they call it light vacuum gas oil, heavy vacuum gas oil, and of course the other remaining material. Now, we'll come back to the processing steps in a minute, but we need to go over one or two things that I think were covered in the previous classes, but very often they pass people by. We have to think a little bit about what makes a good transportation fuel. So we have a refinery, we have things like a crude unit, we have all these other myriad of processing units. Somehow you have to maximize profit but also make a decent fuel, because if you don't make decent fuel, people are not going to buy your stuff, and you're not going to be allowed to sell it because it's not going to meet spec. Now, one of the primary things for gasoline has a whole range of specs on it, but the primary one is that you need a good octane number. And diesel has a similar number. It's called a cetane number. Now, it turns out, very luckily, high octane liquids generally have low cetane, and high cetane liquids generally have low octane. So basically, you separate it out, you end up with a nice high octane material and a nice high cetane material. And things like aromatics, for example, benzene, toluene, xylene, those have high octane, but they don't have very good cetane, so you'd want to put them in the gasoline pool. Now, as we'll see in a few minutes, what happens is, even though you may want to put them in the gasoline pool, you may be aware there are regulations against some of these things. So you cannot always put in everything you want. And we'll see it's sort of a game of the way the refiners have produced fuel, and the way that the air pollution review rules have developed over the years. Now, octane is for spark ignition or gasoline-powered engines. Octane measures the ability to burn smoothly and uniformly without an explosion or a knock. And there are two types of ways something can burn. There's what they call a deflagration, which is a nice smooth burn, and then an explosion or detonation. You get a shock wave, and that shock wave damages the cylinders and that sort of thing, because you end up with the shock, and then you get the wave hitting the equipment, and the engine knocks. And people with good hearing can actually hear the engine knocking. So if you produce a fuel with high octane, the engine will not knock. Low octane fuel, the engine will knock, and obviously you end up eventually with damage to the engines, the loss of power, and things like that. So it's not a good fuel. To measure octane, there are a couple of different ways of doing it. There's what they call a research octane number, and there's a particular test, and they update these tests over time. So ASTM, there's a whole bunch of ASTM tests for different types of products. There's a research octane number and a motor octane number. And what you actually see on the pump in the United States is the RON plus the MON divided by 2. So research octane number, the motor octane number, and then you divide it by 2. So when you buy 87 octane, it's R plus M over 2. And to give you an idea, the standard reference fuels Isooctane is 100 octane, and normal heptane is 0. So that's how they assign the octane numbers. But basically, you know from your own driving experience that you've got 87, 89, and 91. And so you need something in that sort of range if you want to put it in gasoline. Now, if you look for typical refinery streams, the light straight run gasoline is the gasoline that comes straight off the crude column. It doesn't go through any other processing. That's why they call it straight run, because it's got a straight run from the crude tanks through the crude unit straight into the blending pool. The problem with light straight run, you can see 72 and 68. Sensitivity is just the difference between them. Something that's 72 octane, when you need an 87 octane to sell it, that's not very useful stuff. So obviously you have to blend something in this to get it somewhere closer to 87 so that you can at least sell it. And these other streams, Reformate comes from a reformer. Basically, a reformer makes aromatics, and so you can see it's got a 98, 88. It's got a very, very good octane. Alkylate has reasonably good octane. Butane, which is very light material, was a lighter fluid. That's a pretty good octane. FCC gasoline, this is a fluid catalytic cracking unit. It's a cracking process. So you end up with these blend streams, and then you have a little linear program and various other techniques to try and blend something that will meet the octane requirements. Now, in the past, the easiest way to get some octane was to blend in tetraethyl lead. And that made what we used to call leaded gasoline. And that's still, I think, used in some parts of the world. But basically, in this country, we don't use it anymore. But these are the main methods for improving octane. Okay, you can either add lead, add butane, increase the aromatic content, or you can process it with processes such as alkylation. We'll talk just a little bit about that. Now, the first thing, tetraethyl lead, as I mentioned, it's now banned in the United States for several reasons. First of all, the lead gets into the air, and it poisons the catalysts in the catalytic converters that you have in the tailpipe of a vehicle. So basically, gasoline now has to be all unleaded in the United States and in California. There's maybe some leaded gasoline that's available for old farm machinery or something like that, but basically it's all unleaded. Second thing that you can do is to add butane. Butane is relatively cheap. You add it to gasoline and it will raise the octane number. But there's a problem. When you add something very light, then it's going to increase the volatility of the gasoline. It makes it evaporate more easily. And that increases the vapor pressure of gasoline. And with gasoline, the critical vapor pressure is what we call a Reid vapor pressure, or RVP. It's measured by, again, an ASTM test. It's basically the vapor pressure in PSI absolute at 100 Fahrenheit. It's roughly speaking. There's a special test procedure that you have to follow. Now, the problem is, if you make the gasoline too volatile, then you get a lot of emissions into the air, evaporative emissions, so you get smog. So basically, gasoline now has an RVP cap, or an upper limit. So you can see where we're kind of in a game of cat and mouse here, that everything we find to add to the gasoline pool ends up getting either regulated out or restricted in some way. Now, the next thing we have is to increase the aromatic content. Benzene, toluene, and xylene. Basically take a naphtha stream, you process it in a reformer, and one type of reformer is a CCR, continuous catalytic regeneration reformer, and you basically make aromatics and you produce hydrogen. And that's a very useful process, because the aromatics, that's high octane, and hydrogen is very useful in a refinery because for hydrotreating processes and this sort of thing. So most refiners, if not all refiners, have a reformer of some type. It may not be a continuous catalytic regeneration reformer, it might be an older type, but basically this is a good process, but obviously there's always a downside. Benzene is carcinogenic, causes cancer, and so in California benzene is limited. These are the 96 regulations. It's limited to 1% by volume. I think they're either reducing it down to 0.8 or they're trying to reduce that even further. But let's say 1% or less. Aromatics limited to 25% by volume. So you can put some aromatics in